Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And today I have the pleasure of conversing with my friend Joseph Capizzi, professor at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C., about his recent fascinating article analyzing the latest encyclical from Pope Francis, Fratelli, Tutti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Well
And
done.
specifically, Joe is examining what it has to say or how it relates to the church's historic stance on just war teaching, which of course is of special interest to Providence. So, Joe, thank you so much for joining this conversation, and please give us the definitive explanation of what the Pope is saying about just war teaching.
Great. Well, thank you, first of all, Mark. It's my pleasure to talk to you again, and obviously to talk on behalf of Providence about serious questions relating to the use of force. I think there's let's say there's almost like two ways of looking at this. One way of looking at it, and I think this is what has animated a lot of Catholic and also Catholic responses, but also the responses of those who care about the just war tradition, like other writers of Providence, is to think of it in terms of some sort of movement being made by the church away from the classical analysis of thinking about the justification of the use of force, which we call for shorthand just war. Another way of looking at it, I think, would just be instead to sort of place it in the context of the magisterial tradition of papal pronouncements on war. And that's part of what I did in the essay, that second thing, which was to say, for a long time, the popes have been saying war is a failure, right? War is no longer an apt means of pursuing certain kinds of political goods. Both of those approaches, I think, can be maintained simultaneously. We can sort of look at to what extent there's a kind of trend in Catholicism or in Catholic teaching away from just war analysis. Also looking at the way popes in particular have spoken about these kinds of questions. And I don't think they're incompatible. I do think that there has been a papal trend away from the justification for the use of force, a kind of narrowing of those justifications that mirrors, maybe lags a little bit the way that the popes have thought about capital punishment, right? Increasingly kind of sharpening and narrowing what they see as the justification for these things, even while they recognize, at some sense, the rationale, the apparatus for thinking about these kinds of acts, capital punishment and just war, remains in place in some ways. You're muted, Mark. I don't know why.
I'm sorry, I put us on mute because that cricket is in my house. I didn't want to interrupting our conversation.
No problem. And he already did.
Right. The cricket has won.
That's right.
So when the Pope seems to refer negatively to Augustine and his role in developing the just war tradition, what is your response to that reference?
I call that kind of puzzling. I find that footnote puzzling. It's under-explained, and there's, again, at least two ways of seeing it as puzzling or under-explained. The first is that Augustine doesn't really provide the kind of criteria the footnote refers to in the paragraph from which it comes. That criteria develops over time, and like really canonically, it appears in St. Thomas Aquinas's work, and then it gets used by the theological tradition, Catholic and non-Catholic, over time, and even refined over time. So it's not really Augustine's rational criteria, I think is the language that the footnote uses. It's rational criteria that are developed and articulated by other people later. It's implicit in Augustine, for sure, right? But the deeper shortcoming in my analysis is that the encyclical and Pope Francis's language really relies on just war analysis in order to criticize the invocations of just war language in the recent past. So actually, we're not really getting rid of that kind of analysis. We're using that, we continue to use that kind of analysis. The encyclical itself continues to use that kind of analysis in order to point to what it considers some unjustifiable uses of force, where the language was rhetorically bent by people in the past. And I'd even say more strongly, we actually can't abandon that language. We can't abandon that thinking, because it's just the language and the thinking of good moral action analysis. It's intentionality, end, cause, means. I mean, these are all just the good tools of any kind of action analysis, including political action analysis.
Is it not accurate to say that the Catholic Church's political theology and its understanding of the state, built into it, is the premise that the state must, not just can, but must use lethal force in some circumstances in pursuit of the public good?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I wouldn't use the language of state. I would use the language of governing authority, number one, because state presupposes a kind of historical, right, entity that comes into being over time, right? So I'd modify, your claim just in that respect, but I'd say, as a consequence of sin, yes, right? The political theology of the church assumes that the use of force is going to be necessary in certain circumscribed contexts. This is a consequence of the fallenness of human nature and the discord, right, that prevails as a consequence of that fallenness. We're not going to be without that fallenness in our lived experiences of communal relationships as human beings. And therefore, political authorities do sometimes have to make use of the instruments of force to essentially realign wills, right? To resist wills that are acting against certain goods, and perhaps to realign wills that are in discord with each other. Again, this is analogous to punishment, right? Punishment exists as a consequence of human sin, and punishment can be done justly and unjustly, but that it can be done justly is important for the ongoing operation of political authority over time.
And you saw the interview I had with Father Drew Christensen a
I
long
always
time.
watch your interviews, Mark.
Well, I'm sure you took a special interest in that, in the sense that he's a longtime ethicist who has especially
Yep.
focused on the ethics of nuclear weapons over the years. But as he explained it, the Pope is essentially working along the lines of away from just war teaching, but affirming de facto responsibility to protect and the obligation at times to intervene militarily on for humanitarian purposes. Would you agree with that interpretation?
I would agree with it, both in terms of his analysis of what he thinks Pope Francis is doing, or what the popes even are doing since, John Paul II included, Pope Benedict as well, and also in terms of how, like, the rationale, the Catholic rationale for the just use of force. I have my problems with the language of the responsibility to protect, but what you see in the modern papacy is, as Father Drew said, a concern that is different from what you see in, like, Protestant understandings of just war analysis or Protestant defenses of realism. And that is a much more robust sense of the role of international authority in authorizing the use of force. The popes have, since the middle of the 20th century, looked to international authority to try to resolve political problems and to build itself up, either through international developments in international law or developments in international organizations themselves, to be arbiters in conflict, to be circumscribing the just uses of force, the means of force, and so on, and to be building the kinds of habits of political statesmanship that'll look to solve problems without using the instruments of war. And responsibility to protect is a particular kind of movement towards that international authorization of force, right? You're more or less trying to create a situation that is like the domestic analogy in punishment, right? Where you create some international source of authority that judges when it's appropriate to step in on behalf of a persecuted minority, even or persecuted population. Doesn't even have to be a minority, a persecuted population, even justifying the uses of instruments of force in those situations. And I think Father Drew is absolutely right that this is a trend you're seeing in papal pronouncements. I think it's a trend totally consistent with the rationale of just war analysis, tracing way back, through the centuries, especially in some of the Spanish scholastics like Francisco Vitoria and Suarez. I think you see elements of this already there as well.
And so if the Catholic Church continues on this road of moving away from traditional just war teaching, is there still a role within the church for Catholic theologians who affirm the traditional teaching?
I'm rejecting the premise, Mark. We're not moving. We're not moving away from traditional just war theory. What you're seeing is the reemergence of a just war theory that, unlike, I think, arguably, the more Protestant variants of it, is less nation-state dependent. Okay, I think Protestant variants of it are, generally speaking, more nation-state dependent. The Catholic variants of it are less nation-state dependent. They've existed in the context of empire. They've existed in the context of free nation states. You see this. You see this in, again, like the Spaniards as they're encountering indigenous populations of the Americas, and they're trying to figure out how do we respond rightly to what's happening here, in their considerations of to what extent are these human beings members of political communities to which we have responsibilities. And what part of what Fratelli Tutti is doing, part of what you see in Centesimus Annus in its first opening sections, is this recognition that political communities, and let's say like nation states, right, are contingent things, right? They are not morally prior to the goods of peoples or to the goods of individual human beings. They serve those things, and certain kinds of political threats to their existence have to be met with an openness to increasing inclusivity, right? To recognizing that when we respond with force to some threat, we have to be open to our enemy as a potential member of our political community after this is over, or potential member of a kind of political international community or regional community that is going to have to coexist. This is why the popes always say, or always begin these kinds of analysis by saying, peace is not merely the absence of war, right? It's also bringing these people into our communities with whom we have fought, with whom we have ideological differences, where we're trying now to incorporate them more robustly into a thriving political community that is actually pursuing a peace, a deeper peace than is simply the absence of war. So I don't think it's a movement away from the traditional account. I think it's a movement away from an account that is very nation state dependent. And it can be criticized on those grounds too. I mean, you can say you're overly optimistic about either the demise of the nation state or the capacities of international authority not themselves to express particular political ideologies or particular political agendas. I think these are all real considerations that have to be weighed But the popes are leaning on negotiation, solidarity, right, inclusivity, Fratelli, Tutti, right, like this notion of brothers all, that we're really brothers beneath ideological differences. We're really brothers beneath scarcity of resources and so on. And these things ought to help bring us together absent recourse to force.
It sounds like at the very least, when the church describes justified resort to force, a different kind of language will be used other than the phrase just war. Is that correct?
Maybe, yeah, probably. So one of the things that's interesting, right, is if you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, right, and you look at its section on the use of, where it talks about use of force, the language of just war is hesitatingly in there. It's not like Catholic official documents don't typically refer to just war. There's no like official just war theory. There's a kind of, I think it might even be in quotation marks. I think, or it'd say something like this is, the so-called just war or something. It's not like this kind of fulsome embrace of that language, but I don't think that relates to the apparatus of apt thinking about the political act, right? What Ramsey, O'Donovan, others have called the political act, and that act of judging and of serving judgment by the instruments that are at the hands of those in political authority, even up to the use of force. That the rationale, right, which is what makes that footnote puzzling, the rationale, it remains in place, and I really do think it has to remain in place. And you see even Francis in Fratelli Tutti, by implication, at minimum, sort of relying on that language in order to reject certain kinds of recent conflicts.
And so finally, Joe, you're obviously aware of the Pope's many, many critics who
Yes.
allege that, who are not silent, and who allege that he is moving the church away from traditional teaching on a variety of fronts. But you would believe that that is not the case, and that there is a discernible continuity in his pronouncements and the church's historic teaching.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I don't want to dismiss the fact of confusion, right, in the world. And I think the confusion is deeper than this Pope or prior popes. It's not like Pope Francis is the first Pope where people are scratching their heads about things that he's saying, right? That happens for sure with Pope Benedict, and to some extent, probably a lesser extent with Pope John Paul II. But we live in a different age, right? Social media in particular is toxic for clarity. And I mean, you see the critics of the popes themselves going after each other over issues of confusion and lack of clarity. His teaching on war, I see as consistent in the way I've said. And I also think it's traditional teaching. Its emphases are different. I think there is a trend that is narrowing the sort of state justification of war, right? That, again, we're used to. His teaching on property, I find perfectly consistent with the tradition. It's newly emphatic in ways that are, responsive to massive, inequalities of distribution and so on, right? So it's emphasizing the good of universal destination of goods and so on. But that's been in papal teaching for ages, and it's old teaching in in Protestant and Catholic, right, theology. And I think the same is true of other aspects of Catholic moral teaching. So I don't see him as as the maverick that some of his critics think of him being.
Joseph Capizzi, a professor at Catholic University of America, thank you very much for, as an expected, very educational conversation about Pope Francis's latest encyclical and how it relates to just war teaching.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure. And of course, thank the cricket as well.
It was a conversation of three.
That's right. Okay, take care, Mark. Anytime.